level. This is now, it's based on achieving recognized standards. It's based on academic peer review, including external elements. There is no cap on the number of places. There are regular 6-monthly deadlines. High levels of performance are expected across each of the 3 core criteria as appropriate to contract. And I'll elaborate on that later in the presentation, but basically the 3 areas are research/scholarship, teaching and learning, and contribution. Candidates are expected to demonstrate that they are performing at the level to which they have applied for promotion and are likely to continue performing at that level. That's what we mean by trajectory. It doesn't mean we expect you all to be on a Mount Everest trajectory. It means that you're already up there, you've been up there for a while, and you're expected to continue to be up there. So note, colleagues, that, for example, when people say I've taken on such and such a course directorship or committee chair or whatever, it makes more of an impression when you've been doing it for a few years than if you took it up in the last 6 months or a year. Okay. You know, this is about sustained trajectory. And then all normal academic and administrative activity can be included in the application, whether explicitly referred to in the guidelines or not. We can't possibly have guidelines that cover every last opportunity or have a reference to every last item of activity, but if it's part of your job, then it fits in there somewhere on the application form. And sometimes it can fit in several places, and it's up to you to make a call. It's critical that you do not engage in duplication within the form. You will not get credit for the same activity twice. And by that I mean, and forgive me if this is later in the presentation as well, but so, you know, it may be that 2 aspects of an activity might be seen as distinct. For example, the research income, when you get an IRC scholarship, for example, the research income to that is credited to the supervisor. And that's fine. That's getting a student in the door. And then also in terms of PhD completions, getting them out the door and completing the PhD. That's 2 different aspects of activity with a postgrad. It's not double counting. But be careful about what you go for. Getting a big grant, for example, may be achievement in terms of a grant. You need to make the case, if you want to include that as leadership, as to how you've actually led. If you just got the grant last week, then you probably haven't led on it yet and haven't evidenced the leadership element of that. Okay. So, and leadership, frankly, what we expect is more than just, I got a lot of grants and I led on them. Leadership is more than that. So all academics with a minimum of 3 years service in an academic post at the University of Galway are eligible to apply to any higher grade, irrespective of current grade. The other thing, and it's a quirk in the system, and it's not without its challenges, is that someone on a Lecturer A contract may apply for Senior Lecturer B and vice versa, but be clear about the expectations. So if you've been a Lecturer B and you haven't been doing very much research, Senior Lecturer A is not the soft option. You've got to show how you've been performing at Senior Lecturer A level in order to get Senior Lecturer A. Okay? And vice versa. The promotion committees, there are now 2, one for applications to SL and to Professor In, and then a separate one for the established professor grade. They are gender balanced, they're exactly 50-50 male and female. The university is committed to equality, diversity, and inclusion in the scheme, and progress is constantly reviewed in this regard. This includes a specific mechanism for recognizing protected leave and adjusting achievements upwards for the purposes of assessment. The basis for this adjustment, by the way, is calculated by the Office of the VP EDI. It's not done in my office, although I do cross-check it with the person in the EDI unit. And what that amounts to at its very simplest application, and it's rarely as simple as this. Let's say somebody's been here for 10 years. They've had 2 maternity leaves, which, whether they took the whole year or not, we count as a whole year. So they've effectively been working for 8 years, and they've got 24 publications. So they've got an average of 3 publications per year. So the multiplier that would be calculated would then lead to that being counted as equivalent to having 3 publications for each of the 2 years on maternity leave. So they would have 30. And the basis on which we would then assess the application would be that they have 30 publications rather than 24. That's a very simple example. Very often it's much more complicated. Somebody's been here 21.5 years and they've had a period of maternity leave and they've maybe had some unpaid leave and whatever. So the multiplier is rarely that simple. But that's at its essence, that takes into account protected leave, okay? And that's the only legal basis we have for doing any of those calculations. So it can be parental leave, it can be maternity leave, it can be carers leave for elderly parents or for anyone else, and so on. But it must be actually leave taken. Candidates may offer in a specific box any additional evidence they may wish to share in respect of their achievements and/or circumstances. And that's simply a free box that you can use to contextualize your achievements. And as begun with round 3, there's a COVID impact box and it remains on the form. This will assist the APC in assessing whether any criteria that are initially deemed as not being achieved are likely to have been achieved but for the impact of COVID. So in assessing any application, we factor in the multiplier for all those things that are quantifiable, like publications, research grants, PhD, postdoc supervisions, and so on. And then we make our assessment. And then if something is very borderline and it's not quite over the line already, we look and see whether the COVID impact box contains evidence that would suggest to us that but for the impact of COVID, it would have got over the line. And that may lead then to a criterion that initially we're thinking it's not quite there. Actually, yeah, taking that into account, it is there. And the final point, and this is critical, financial considerations in respect of affordability to the school or college or the university play no part whatsoever in any individual assessment. Under no circumstances are we looking at any data that suggests that your school or your college or anything else can't afford to have you promoted. That simply is a non-question, never needs to be answered. All unsuccessful candidates will receive detailed written feedback on their application and their agreed score sheet. They may also request an oral feedback meeting in a timely fashion, which is within 30 days of receiving the written feedback. If requested by applicants, further information such as other assessment records, minutes, personal notes, discussion documents, and correspondence is available. Requests should be sent to academicpromotions@universityofgalway.ie. So all that stuff that relates to your application, you no longer need to go through FOI. From this round, you can simply write to Academic Promotions and that material will be forwarded to you. Other documents such as the external assessors reports can be sought if required through the Freedom of Information process. Okay. All unsuccessful candidates may appeal to the Academic Promotions Appeals Committee. It's a requirement of the scheme that a candidate attend for oral feedback in order to be eligible to appeal. Any appeal must be lodged within 30 days of this meeting. The role of the Academic Promotions Appeals Committee is to consider whether or not due process has prevailed in the consideration by the APC of an application for promotion. The APAC may not form a second academic judgment on an application. So that's not a second bite of the cherry. That is a check on whether, in fact, we did our job the way we're supposed to do our job on the Promotions Committee. And the Appeals Committee contains 5 members and is chaired by, one of whom is external, and the chair is a retired senior member of staff from this university. Grounds for appeal. So these are the only grounds for appeal. Failure by the APC, or EPPC as it now is as well, to follow in due manner university policy and procedures for the consideration of applications for promotion. All university policies and procedures are subject to statutory anti-discriminatory requirements. B, a denial of natural justice. And C, manifestly unfair or unreasonable application of the criteria for granting of promotions. An appeal should be sent to that address. Now, manifestly unfair. This is a word that was introduced by the word manifestly by one of the externals, or the external, sorry, on the Appeals Committee, who is from a legal background. So it's not just that you think the decision was unfair. It's that you can indicate clearly and unambiguously that something other than simply the balanced assessment of the panel was brought into play. In other words, we were manifestly unfair. We ignored evidence. But you need to show that as in making an appeal. Okay, and I can say that, of course, you could argue I would say this anyway, but I have been very, very cautious and very careful to try and make sure that we do absolutely have as balanced and as necessary a discussion as possible, as we possibly can, and take as long as we need to. Some applications are very straightforward. They're over the line. There isn't much discussion needed. Others need a lot more discussion against some of the criteria, and we take as long as we need. So, but if you feel that manifestly we have done something that is unfair, then you need to show what that is, and that will be taken up by the appeals committee. So from this round 9, and actually retrospectively for the established professor applications from round 8, there are 2 promotions committees. The APC, as I said earlier, will consider applications for senior lecturer, associate professor, both type A and type B, and for all professor-in applications. The EPPC will consider established professor applications. So for the APC and how it proceeds, because it has 16 members, the established professor committee only has 10, and I'll come to that in a moment. The APC is the same committee that has been constituted every round up to now. In advance of the meeting, 4 committee members are allocated as core readers to each application to go through the individual application in particularly fine detail. 2 core readers are from the relevant college, and 2 are from non-college, i.e. from one or more of the other colleges. And in all cases, it's 2 men and 2 women. Okay. Now, we all read everything, but sometimes the volume of applications is such that we just need some people to pay particular attention to the detail of applications, and that's what the 4 core readers do. And I try and spread the workload as balanced a way as I can among the 12 members who are representatives of the colleges, of the 4 colleges on the committee. One of the 4 core readers will be designated feedback lead and takes detailed notes during discussions that form the basis of the feedback to applicants. The feedback is subsequently agreed by all. So I say all applications are read by each member of the committee, and each member of the committee assesses and scores each application individually prior to the meeting. Those scores are on a provisional basis, and I probably need to insert that into the presentation before it goes up online. The 2 external members of the committee on the APC do not score the applications. The committee as a whole discusses and agrees a consensus score for each criterion for each candidate. The relevant achievement has to be demonstrated in order for each criterion to receive a consensus decision of yes, i.e. that criterion has been achieved. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. For the EPPC, so there are 10 members of the EPPC, 2 representing disciplines in each of the 4 colleges, plus the 2 ex officio members, the registrar and the vice president research. And 2 of those 10 representing the college areas are the 2 external members from the APC, one of whom is in the STEM area, one of whom is in the non-STEM area. So in advance of the EPPC, it will be 2 committee members are allocated as core readers to each application to go through the individual application, particularly fine detail. 1 core reader from the relevant college and 1 from another college with 50-50 gender representation. 1 of the 2 is designated feedback lead and takes detailed notes during discussions that form the basis of the feedback to applicants. The feedback is subsequently agreed by all. All applications are read by each member of the committee, so it's the same as with APC, except that we have a smaller committee, and that's simply a resourcing issue. In terms of trying to meet the gender balance, make sure we've got external input, and not trying to recruit half a dozen professors from around Ireland and elsewhere to be part of what is a very intensive promotion scheme here. And that was signed off by Academic Council earlier this year. All applications are read by each member of the, late last year. All applications are read by each member of the committee. Each member of the committee assesses and scores each application individually prior to the meeting. Again, those are provisional scores. The committee as a whole discusses and agrees a consensus score for each criterion for each candidate, and the same rule applies. The relevant achievement has to be demonstrated in order for each criterion to receive a consensus decision of yes. So this is how each of the 2 committees proceed. Individuals do not, outside the meeting, under any circumstances, have conversations or correspondence with each other about how they're scoring it. They do it in splendid isolation. And each member of the committee then, in advance of the meeting, submits their provisional scores in respect of each candidate. The scores are then transposed to a spreadsheet, and this is the basis for the discussion at the meeting. The scoring of each individual criteria is on a 3-point system. Now, it's not a 3-point scale, as in 3 is top-notch, 2 is 2/3 of the way there, and 1 is 1/3 of the way there. That's not how it works. They're not fractions. A score of 1 simply means that the candidate is assessed not to be achieving the criterion. A score of 2 means the assessor is unsure and needs input clarification from the discussion at APC or EPPC. A score of 3 means the candidate is achieving the criterion in the opinion of that assessor working on their own. So at that stage, there's a 3-point scoring scheme, and the score of 2 is in there because you might have a professor of engineering looking at an application from history, or a professor of law looking at an application from computer science, and there's some aspect of that application they're simply not sure. So they give it a 2. Okay? But that's the provisional score. Those sheets are then tabulated by the work that Orla does, which is massive work behind the scenes, by the way, and not always appreciated in some of the correspondence from disappointed candidates afterwards, I don't mind saying. I've been copied into some of that. So whatever the outcome, I would simply say to everyone, maintain the appropriate tone in all correspondence. Those scores are tabulated. And where there is a majority of 3s and no 1s, the score would be an automatic yes under this criterion. And a panel member might raise a discussion point and say something like, I gave it a 3. It was kind of just about over the line for me. Here's a bit of useful feedback. But basically, it's an automatic 3. That's a yes. All other profiles, so if there are any 1s or if it isn't a majority of 3s, necessitate further discussion. And from this discussion, consensus usually emerges. 90-odd% of the time, a consensus emerges. There must be a consensus that a criterion is being achieved for a final consensus decision of yes. The consensus decision can only be yes or no. And as I said earlier, the protected leave multiplier and COVID-19 impact are factored into the discussions and decisions in the way that I outlined earlier. Now, I'll share now a typical score sheet with you, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we score, bearing in mind these are the provisional scores. So this is an entirely fictitious scoring sheet, but the way I would proceed if presented with this in the meeting would be as follows. So assessor, you see the assessors, each row are the scores of an assessor. So criterion 1, research and scholarship, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 2s and 10 3s. That's a clear majority of 3s, no 1s. That's an automatic yes. Teaching and learning, unanimously 3s. That's an automatic yes. Contribution, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 2s, 9 3s. Majority of 3s, no 1s. That's an automatic yes. Postgraduate, postdoctoral supervisions, unanimously a 3. And then research impact, there's a 1, 2 1s, so we'll come back to it. Research standing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 1s, we'll come back to it. Innovation and teaching, there's a 1, we'll come back to it. Pedagogic research funding, there's 4 1s, we'll come back to it. So then we've pocketed the 4 automatic yeses at the beginning there, and then we have the discussion, and people make their points. And I ask people, invite people to make a comment why you gave it a 1, why you gave it a 3. I thrash it out, I bring in as many voices as possible, especially the core readers. And when I think I hear a consensus emerging, I will make a suggestion. Sounds to me like this is going towards a yes. And I'm specifically inviting those who originally gave it a 1 to say, yeah, that's fine by me, or no, I'm not convinced, need a bit more discussion. And sometimes I've made one proposal and following further discussion, it's gone the other way, both from no to yes and from yes to no. And I do that with each of those 4 criteria. And in this fictitious case, 2 of them ended up a yes and 2 of them ended up a no. Sometimes we have a situation where there's basically about 12 3s and 2 1s, and people say, or even 13 3s and a single 1, and people say, how did that not end up a yes? And I need to spell this out. We don't average the scores. They are provisional scores, and that point needs to be made. And no one has a veto. So if only one person or if two people gave a 1, I do not allow the discussion, and all members of the panels have accepted that they do not sit there and say, no, I give it a 1 and that's all there is to it. It's not changing. No one has a veto. But sometimes someone who is closer to the discipline may have particular knowledge and point out something that says to the others, I hadn't spotted that when I was sitting in my study as a professor of French looking at an application from engineering or whatever it may be. And yes, when you say that, I hear you. My 3 isn't so solid anymore. Okay? And that is how the consensus score is arrived at. Very occasionally, we simply have a division of opinion. Some people are still convinced that it should be a yes. Other people are still convinced that it should be a no. It's never a single veto. That simply doesn't happen. And if we don't have a consensus that the criterion is met, then under the rules of the scheme, by definition, it is not met. Okay? Because we go to external assessors afterwards with the prima facie case. And what we say to the external assessors is, we believe this person should be promoted. Do you, based on your experience and where you work, believe that they would be promoted in your place and should be promoted here? We can't go to the externals and say, we can't make up our mind, tell us what to do. That's not how promotion schemes work in the vast majority of places, and it's not how this one works. Okay? So I'll happily take questions at the end of that, but I hope that's clear. We seek a consensus. Nobody has a veto, but the broad parameters of the profiles of yes and no's don't always finish where they might first look on the provisional, because information is introduced that people who are not as close to the discipline very often would not have had when they were issuing their provisional scores. Now, I'll move on. So some additional details. As candidates, you are expected to engage fully with your head of school, both before applying and after the outcome of the process. A head of school form, which must be countersigned by the dean, will be submitted by the head of school. The candidate will have a right of reply. 2 external members with senior academic experience are on the APC, 1 STEM, 1 Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, Business Law, both with significant experience across research and teaching and learning. And they are full members of the Established Professor Committee as well, where they will be scoring. They don't score in the APC. The default adjective as used in the guidelines for criteria at each level, unless one of the others is explicitly used for an individual criterion, is as follows: substantial for senior lecturer, associate professor, outstanding for the new professor in discipline, professor in grade, and exceptional for established professor. And you'll see there's a nuance to that depending on which pathway you choose when you go for either of the professorial grades. But I'll come to that later in the presentation. Following assessment and the establishment by the promotions committee of a prima facie case, external assessors are ranked by the committee from lists provided by the applicant and head of school. This list should be at least 50% international. Early in the scheme, we had 1 or 2 heads of school who were listing all from UCC, UCD, and Trinity, and we kind of thought, this is an internationally benchmarked promotion scheme. There needs to be an international element to that. Promotion will only follow if the external assessors clearly agree with the recommendation of the APC. They should be at least at the academic level in their own institution, which the candidate is applying for. So you can't put down someone who's at senior lecturer level if you're going for professor. You can't put down someone at professor level if you're going for senior lecturer. And they should be in an institution, or at the very least in a department of similar or higher reputational standing. These assessors must have no conflict of interest. Both the candidate and the head of school should avoid nominating anyone with whom the school or research institute has had recent formal interaction or with whom the candidate has collaborated. Guidelines, re conflict of interest, are now on the promotions website. Please do not nominate recent collaborators, colleagues. Okay? And that means going back several years. Okay? Or recent external examiners in the department, whatever. These are meant to be neutral external assessors. They should be familiar with your work simply because your work has a profile, not because they have engaged with you. Assessors must also have appropriate experience of promotions to be able to carry out the task of assessing the prima facie case. We ask them all these questions, by the way, when we write to them, and ask them to declare any conflict of interest, etc., etc. So under no circumstances should either you or the head of school contact external assessors in advance of or during the process. I need to be absolutely explicit about that, colleagues. Every time there's somebody who basically says, I didn't know that. It's there in black and white. Read all the guidelines. If you know anybody else who's not here thinking of applying, make sure they read the guidelines on this presentation as well. External assessors are requested to complete a conflict of interest declaration form prior to completing an assessment. Reapplication is not normally permitted within 2 years of an unsuccessful application for any grade. So it's not that you can go for a higher grade, be unsuccessful, and immediately then go for the grade below. You can't. If you're unsuccessful, you're normally excluded for 2 years. But there are a couple of exceptions, and we'll come to those shortly, where it's basically 1 year. From the point at which you applied, not from the point at which you got the result. The established professor promotional route was introduced in round 8, replacing the personal professor as a promotional route. A new promotions committee has been constituted to assess the EP applications, as this was not in place for round 8. Round 8 applications had to be held over. Round 8 applicants for EP have been provided with options around their applications, so they can leave it in. It will be assessed against the round 8 application. That will be the first item on the agenda when the committees meet after the deadline. And or they can simply freshen it all up and submit to round 9. Either way, if they have the application in round 8, if they are successful, their promotion will be backdated to whatever the date would have been for successful candidates from round 8. The criteria are largely the same as for PP, but with an enhanced leadership requirement. And existing personal professors, like all other grades, must go through the application procedure in order to be promoted to established professor. And I should say, colleagues, that we've typically said that the professor in grade is about halfway between the expectation for SL and established professor in terms of numbers of publications, research income, which varies, of course, by discipline. All of this varies by discipline, postgrad, postdocs, and so on. But being a professor in or established professor involves a significant leadership element. So I would almost suggest that our expectations in terms of the leadership you bring to the table is a step change above SL. Okay? And be mindful of that. I wouldn't almost suggest it. I'm saying it. In round 5, of course, and it's well established now, we've had 4 rounds of it. A new grade was approved by Údarás na HOllscoile in December 2021, is open as a professor in whatever the discipline may be, promotional route. The established professor was approved by Údarás na HOllscoile in June 23 and replaced the personal professor from round 8. Each of these grades has 3 pathways: teaching and learning, research and scholarship, leadership. The level of achievement, and I was saying some of this a minute ago, but it bears reiterating, the level of achievement expected for promotion to professor in is exactly halfway between that for SL and AP and that for established professor. Candidates should note that leadership plays a more significant role at professor in level. So that's in essence what I've just been saying. So that although the expectations in terms of the numerical stuff is exactly halfway, leadership plays a more significant role. It is a step change up. The level of achievement expected for promotion to established professor is double that of SLAP with an enhanced leadership expectation. In line with the principles that apply in this scheme, all promotional grades are open to all academic staff. You're not restricted to applying simply for the next stage up. It will be possible to fail to meet a single non-core criterion in your application and still be promoted if in the assessment of the APC there are enough compensating achievements in the rest of the application. Following a considered discussion, the committee agreed on wording that they would use as a principle in determining in a safe and consistent manner if an applicant established a prima facie case in the round. And that is the case where the candidate's achievements in a majority of other criteria are, in the academic judgment of APC, significantly above the required level. Okay? And very often you can tell that by looking at the spreadsheet, but we do have a discussion of all of the criteria. If we have had to thrash out whether somebody is over the line because it was a mixture of 3s, 2s, and 1s, then they've probably just about got over the line, unless some information has come to light that has exploded all the reservations that might have been there. If, on the other hand, somebody's getting blanket 3s with just an occasional 2 thrown in, then there's a rational discussion about whether, in fact, that's because they are significantly over the line. But we have that discussion criterion by criterion where someone has failed to meet a single non-core criterion. And a number of people over the round since that was introduced have been promoted in the round, or the prima facie case has been established in the round. And yeah, they have gone on to be promoted. So I talked about the 2-year rule earlier on. And in the event that a prima facie case is not agreed in such circumstances, i.e. candidate has fallen on a single non-core criterion, the 2-year rule is reduced to 1 year. The other exception to the 2-year rule is a retention application. That can go in any time, but it's measured against the same standards. So if you're successful, you can apply again immediately to go up to the next grade. If you fail on a single non-core criterion, but you're not promoted, you cannot apply for any level for 1 year. And if you fail on any core criterion, and we'll come to the core and non-core later in the presentation, or indeed if you fail on more than one non-core criterion, then you cannot apply for 2 years. And that, colleagues, is really about incentivizing, taking the feedback, learning, improving, rather than simply coming back and effectively saying, look, you didn't understand my application. Okay, that's what the appeals mechanism is for, really. And then another innovation is to consider that following the decision by Uterus na Hulskul in December 2021 to approve the use of US-style titles, those promoted to SL will be able to use the title Associate Professor. And the forms have been amended in line with the new guidelines, but also to allow more commentary following on from feedback meetings. So I think every box now where you're being asked for data, there is a box that allows you to contextualize and comment on the data, be it research income, be it postgraduate, postdoc completions, etc. Couple of changes for round 9. So, and the changes are italicized here, numbers 4 and 5. So we need an up-to-date IRIS profile. We've always needed that. It makes it for ease of reading for the assessment panel. If your publications are by category and in reverse chronological order within each category, so you can download the IRIS profile and edit it in those terms. Student feedback of up to 2 pages, a teaching portfolio of up to 23 pages. Any information beyond the 23 pages in the teaching portfolio will not be considered. You'll be given an option to have it either blacked out, or it will write to you if you go over the 23 pages, saying the following will be blacked out. Ditto if you go over the word limits in boxes. These words will be blacked out, these pages will be blacked out, and it will proceed like this, or you can withdraw and resubmit with everything within the limits. Okay. 2 new things, and we consulted with the unions, and this opportunity was welcomed. You identify the 3 strongest / most important publications of yours. A commentary of 300 words maximum per publication is required, indicating the originality, significance, and rigor of the publication, and in the case of multi-author publications, the role of the applicant. Okay, so that's a chance for you to basically tell the panel and the external assessors, if you establish a prima facie case, these are my particular strengths. This is what I'm particularly proud of, or has had the most significant impact, or whatever it may be. And then a list of the next up to 20 strongest, most important publications, and no commentary is required there for those publications. So that's 20 in addition to the 3, so 23 in total. No commentary required other than to outline the role of the candidate for multi-authored papers. Okay, and you know, the definitions, especially in multi-authored ones, the definitions of where lead authors sit can vary wildly from discipline to discipline. Some it's first, second, and last. Others it's simply alphabetical, and then it's not clear. Other disciplines might have and that's where we often have the expertise in the panel. Where we don't, I will go to maybe a head of school or a head of discipline or whatever and ask for advice. But that's for you to outline what you think are your really strongest publications. And then what has always been there as well, the external assessor nomination form. So be mindful of that. If you were working on an application for a previous round, by the way, the forms change each round. because there have been tweaks and changes and enhancements and improvements to the system. So if you've been working on an earlier version of the form, do not use it, do not submit on it. You will have to cut and paste everything onto the latest form, which has been available since 18th of January, I think I'm right in saying, Orla. But those 4 and 5 are 2 new additional items that are required. Bearing in mind, incomplete applications will be returned to the applicant and you'll be invited to apply again to the next round, which is 6 months away. Also for round 9, we require confirmation both from yourself on the form and from your head of school that your performance for growth review is up to date. We don't want to see a copy of the performance for growth document that is confidential between you and your head of school or head of discipline, but we need the confirmation that it is up to date. And then something that's also been introduced for round 9, and this is entirely optional, but we've had some people who have been unsuccessful, have reapplied a couple of years later, and then fallen down on something that they actually were meeting the criteria on a couple of years previously. Now that's simply because, you know, the trajectory piece, we expect you to be currently performing in this. It might have been very borderline 2 or 3 years ago and you got the benefit of the doubt, but if little has been added in the 2 or 3 years since, it's entirely possible that you're no longer meeting that criterion because it's not pocketed. But a suggestion from the appeals committee was that where that happens, that someone is meeting a criterion in one application, but then falling down a couple of years later, that it would be useful to have some, what we're calling a confidence check. So after all the deliberations have done, after we've got our prima facie scores, Orla will be the administrator who will identify, there, you know, Paul O'Doherty is falling down there on research income and he was getting it 2 years ago. Is the panel confident with that current verdict? That's what that amounts to, that will be a confidence check. We can only do that if you give us permission to look at your, in other words, if you give Orla permission to look at your previous application when you were unsuccessful in the event that this happens. So that's a box to tick on the form, but you can of course change your mind then afterwards by emailing that address, okay? And again, that's just to try and reinforce and enhance consistency within the system. It's entirely plausible that someone fails on a criterion 2 years later, where, as I say, perhaps on balance, the panel had given it to the individual. But this is about just making absolutely double sure that we're now no longer giving that criteria, or indeed, maybe the confidence check will say, you know what, on balance, maybe we should give it. So there are 2 sets of academic promotions guidelines. One is for the research and scholarship track, and the other is for the teaching and learning track. And the leadership track, you can work off either, because it's a kind of, it recognizes that in the leadership pathway, some of your strengths might be research, some of them might be teaching and learning, but the primary one is leadership. So it's not a specific leadership track set of documents, but there's 2 sets of documents there. So contract type B for the research scholarship, professor in research and leadership tracks, personal professor research and leadership tracks. If you go to the leadership track, there is a degree of optionality that does not exist on the research scholarship and the teaching and learning tracks, okay? And then teaching and learning, it's for contract type A at SL, professor in and personal professor in the teaching and learning tracks. A change since round 7, student feedback. There have been schools in which no formal independent student feedback system was in place. This was to be addressed by schools for a future promotions round effective from round 7. As outlined in the feedback on modules and programs policy, schools and colleges are responsible for ensuring that such feedback practices are undertaken. Deans, heads of school, and their nominees are responsible for ensuring that it has been carried out and acted upon for all modules and programs. That's an all-staff email, 11th November 2022. So you need to submit formal student feedback, not your own privately run student feedback. Okay. Sorry. So let's look, first of all, at senior lecturer contract type A, which is the teaching and scholarship contract. So the core criteria are research scholarship, teaching, supervision and mentoring, and then contribution. Lecturer type A is not required to carry out original research. It's what used to be called in this university teacher until 6 or 7 years ago. But some do carry out research, and if you have research, put it in under there. But essentially what you're being judged against is the ways in which you are making absolutely darn sure that your teaching is research informed, up to date, and with developments in pedagogy and in your discipline. As I say, it may include pedagogic research, it may include other research, or a combination of the two. And if you do include research here, elaborate on its significance. But you're not required to have original research to be an SL type A. On the other hand, if you continue down the teaching and learning track and you want to become a professor in or an established professor, you will have to have research, and in particular pedagogic research. Okay, but it's not needed for SL. Then the second bullet point there, record of teaching and learning, supervising, mentoring. And third, contribution, which is both internal and external. Now, this applies to both contract type A and contract type B, what I'm about to say. At senior lecturer level, we have folded internal and external contribution into one criterion, and there is no expected balance between the internal and external. We fully recognize that that can be very much dependent on a whole range of factors that might be beyond your control. So it might be 80% internal and 20% external. It might even be 100 and 0, ideally not, or 100 and 0 the other way. Although if you're making no contribution internally, that's not ideal either. So it might be 80-20, it might be 50-50, whatever. But it's a single criterion. The reason I emphasize that is that when you move up to professor in or established professor level, internal and external contribution are two core criteria, each in their own right. And there's an expectation that you're contributing both internally to the organization, and that's, by the way, at school level, at college level, at university level, and externally, regional, national, or international. So they're separate criteria above SL, but for SL, they're a single criterion. And then contract type B, the second and third bullet points are exactly as I've just outlined, but the first bullet point is that you're expected to have a substantial record of research scholarship. You should list your own research outputs, appropriate to discipline and or interdisciplinary, and elaborate on their significance. Where work is multi-authored, you should in the narrative elaborate on the extent and significance of your own contribution, lead author, contributor, etc. And the expectations in terms of numbers of publications, they're in the guidelines. It's where it's single authored, it's typically 10 to 15 publications, and multi-authored, double that. Bearing in mind, when I talk about publications, I'm talking about high quality publications. And you should think seriously about the quality, even as you're targeting and planning your career. Think about outlets, think about outputs, think about the quality that you're aiming for and getting into the highest journals in the case of journal articles, or prestigious book publishers in the case of edited collections, or indeed in the case of monographs and so on. Externals may well read some of this stuff. We do read some of it ourselves, but we are not judging we're using proxies by and large for the quality of the outputs. Okay. As well as the disciplinary expertise that we have on the panel. So that's contract type B. It's the same as contract type A, except that the difference is that for contract type A, you don't need original research. Contract type B, you do. Then at SL, you have 10 additional criteria, and I'll say a little bit about each of them briefly. And you can mix and match. Okay, so external research leadership, the 5 on the left are effectively research oriented. The 5 on the right are teaching and learning oriented. So Roman 1 to 5, external research leadership. It's important to note, and people keep doing it, but you have got to spell it out for us. The extent to which any committee membership or reviewing role included here constitutes leadership must be clearly demonstrated. A list largely of memberships, is unlikely to meet this criterion. Memberships may well point to standing, international research standing in the discipline. If you want to make the case that your membership of something is indicative of leadership, research leadership, you've got to spell that out. Okay. Second thing is successful supervision to completion of doctoral students or supervision of postdoctoral researchers, or a combination of the two. And the other PGR activity that you might write about in the box there is contextual for us. So we need an absolute minimum, no matter what discipline you're in, of at least 2 successful PhD completions or postdoctoral researchers of similar kind of length and standing, outline what they've achieved, gone on to achieve. The boxes all allow for that. But that's in the areas where they are rare as hen's teeth. In some disciplines, that would not cut it at all. Okay? So take advice. You're not competing with anybody to get this promotion. Take advice. Look at the profiles of some of the successful candidates. They are on the promotions website from the first 5 or 6 rounds. And try and make a call as to whether this, remember, this is an optional criterion. So if you're in doubt, you might be better thinking of using one of the other criteria. 3, research funding. And again, some disciplines, an impressive record might have barely got you into next week in some of the more really expensive disciplines. So be it. We do our best to judge that. The impact of research beyond academia. It's critically important that you understand that properly. Beyond academia. This is not beyond the university. This is not collaboration with other universities, unless you are taking it outside the university world, into wider society, into culture, into business, into manufacture, whatever it may be. And then international research standing in the discipline, and that could be a whole range of things, invitations to PhD external, to be on various boards, committees, review groups, etc., etc. Okay, invitations to give keynotes and so on. They all speak to international research standing. But if you want to take any of the things that sometimes fit in, that usually fit in there, and define them as leadership, you've got to spell out how that is leadership rather than simply recognition of your standing. Item 6, maintaining theoretical currency in teaching, showing that your teaching is informed by up-to-date theories in teaching. 7, innovation in teaching, and that is using innovative methodologies in your teaching. This is not simply the introduction of new courses. So if you're going to choose the innovation in teaching box, don't give us a list of all the new courses you introduced. Tell us what you did that was different in terms of the teaching. 8, national standing in teaching and learning, and increasingly that can be international standing in teaching and learning. Impact in teaching and learning. Now, unlike the impact of research beyond academia, the impact in teaching and learning can be that you did things in your teaching and maybe gave seminars on it, and colleagues here or elsewhere adopted some of those things that they saw you doing. That is evidence of impact, that they will be able to then, you'll be able to show how this innovative thing that I did in my chemistry course was noted by colleagues in chemistry in other institutions, and they adopted that. Okay, that's what impact in teaching and learning is around. And then 10, pedagogic funding. Okay. Now, for those who might have a mixture of research funding and pedagogic funding, if you think that you've got loads of pedagogic funding and loads of research funding, then by all means tick both boxes. But if you're primarily one with a little bit of the other, then choose the primary one and add the other information with the other funding with a commentary into that box. Okay? And that will help us form a judgment in terms of whether you're meeting that criterion or not. There are 3 tracks for promotion to either professor in or established professor as follows: research and scholarship, teaching and learning, leadership. The standard of achievement for established professor is typically twice the level expected for senior lecturer, associate professor. Standard of achievement for professor in is 1.5 times that expected for senior lecturer, associate professor. Bearing in mind that, going back to the point, and I can't say it often enough, the leadership expectation is a step up from SL. The core criteria for all professorial tracks are research and scholarship, same as with SL, research and scholarship, teaching and learning, And then the contribution piece, as I indicated earlier, is subdivided into internal academic unit, the college, university, and contribution to the intellectual, cultural, social, or economic life externally to the university. And then additional two criteria, core criteria for the leadership track only, are leadership at university level, significant evidence of the transformative nature of the leadership, and leadership at national or international level. Okay. So this is where I now get into the adjectives that are used, going back to the substantial, outstanding, and exceptional adjectives that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So a professor in, the typical default adjective is outstanding, and the two core criteria for all professor in, no matter which track you go, are the outstanding contribution internally and the outstanding contribution externally. That's common to all the tracks. Okay. Looking at the research and scholarship track, and this is where we kind of recognize that as you're going up through the professorial tracks, you're not going to be a master of every single aspect of the job. Therefore, whatever track you choose, the other aspect of it between research and teaching and learning is maybe one step below that. So if you look at this professor in criterion for research scholarship, we look for a sustained outstanding record of research outputs, which is Roman 1. But if you skip down to Roman 7, which is also core, it's a substantial contribution. So in other words, what was expected, if you're going the professor in research scholarship track, your research needs to make a step up. The teaching needs to be one step below that. And then you don't have optionality around the other criteria. So those are effectively Roman 2 to 6, the 5 research-oriented of the 10 optional ones at SL. So it pays to be basically strategizing around your future career, even at an earlier stage. Okay, you don't have to have those 5 for SL, but those are the 5 if you go the research track. And just as I said about research, core research being outstanding and core teaching being substantial on the research track, if you go on the teaching track, it's the other way around. Outstanding contribution to teaching, but go down to Roman 7, substantial record of research. Okay. But you do have to have the research. And then 2 to 6 are basically the 5 teaching and learning aspects of the 10 options that we had at SL. And then for the leadership track, because there are 6 core criteria in total, the 2 that we've already had, plus these 4, there is then a degree of optionality around using any of the other 3 criteria under PP research or teaching and learning that are not already in the list of core criteria. So I hope that's clear. Happy to take questions, and we're nearly done. I have about 7 or 8 slides left. Moving on to established professor. And this is effectively a repeat of professor in, except that everything is one step up. So the core are both internal and external contribution, and they need to be exceptional rather than outstanding. If you go on the research and scholarship track, you will see that the research needs to be exceptional. The teaching and learning needs to be outstanding, one level below that. And then 2 to 6 are basically the 5 research criteria of the 10 that were at SL. And ditto if we go with the teaching and learning route, 1 and 7 are reversed. So 1 is exceptional contribution to teaching and supervision, but 7 is an outstanding record of research, so 1 level below. And then 2 to 6 are the pedagogic, the teaching and learning optional criteria from the SL grade. And at leadership, it's as with professor in, except that we're now using exceptional. For 1 to 4 there, plus the 2 contribution ones is 6 are core here, whereas it's only 4 core in the other tracks. And therefore there's a degree of optionality around the remaining 3 criteria. A couple of small bits of comment and advice to finish off. Members of the Academic Promotions Committee, the established Professor Promotions Committee, and the Academic Promotions Appeals Committee are bound to absolute confidentiality in respect of all deliberations of the committees, subject only to the fact that documents are FOIable after the process. Under no circumstances should candidates approach or seek to influence members of the APC or APC or EPPC, in fact, on any matter relating to their application or the scheme. Members of all three committees may not advise applicants either individually or in groups in respect of the promotion scheme. And heads of school and deans of college are required to respect and maintain the confidentiality of all individual applications. Some additional advice. Think hard about the quality of journals. If your paper is really good, and we are well aware of both European work that's being done and work that's been done elsewhere around just using raw data, metrics and all that, and we don't approach it that way at all. We have thrashed things out. There is no sense at all. We are given information as background information. There is no sense at all in which we simply go and look at the metrics with all the problems that have been clearly identified in recent years around that we go and look at metrics and say, oh, the metrics say it's not very good, it's not very good, okay? But we do look for high quality outputs. And one proxy indicator of that, it's not the definitive, it's not the final word, and there's a broader profile for everybody. But do think, as you plan your career and as you plot your career, about where you're thinking of publishing and how much effort you're putting into making sure that those are the highest quality papers that you possibly can produce. Second point is your IRIS profile can be downloaded as a Word document and edited. Use clear categorization of types of outputs in line with the application form, and list the publications in each category in reverse chronological order. This is a format that the Promotions Committees welcome and feel is very useful and adds clarity in terms of the assessment of the application. We would ideally like to see this format of categorization followed by applicants in future applications. Colleagues, we've had some quite sloppy IRIS profiles submitted, I don't mind saying, with duplicate publications and no particular order and no particular chronological order or anything else. And it doesn't help. Okay, so do pay attention to that. And then just to remind you that following the deliberations of the APC and the EPPC, there is the external assessment stage of the process. So we establish or don't establish a prima facie case for all applications, but it then needs to go to external assessors. And that can be a laborious process. It doesn't always go as quickly and as smoothly as we would like, because external assessors come back and it turns out there's a conflict of interest. That delays matters. Another reason why you should not nominate people that you've been collaborating with or that have had dealings with the department or whatever. That can be laborious. Sometimes assessments come back and they're ambiguous or they haven't answered the question, in which case we go to another assessor. If an assessor comes back and says, no, actually that person's not meeting the criteria, that stands. Okay. But it's just a reminder that whilst you will get a letter from us indicating whether there was a prima facie case established or not, the final word is dependent on the external assessors. And I can say that in the first 3 years, we haven't completed everything from the 4th year yet, but in the first 3 years, there has only been a single case where the prima facie case was not confirmed by the external assessors. So it's not quite something you can take to the bank, that letter of the prima facie case, but it's a strong indicator. Deadlines are at 4 p.m. on the last working day of the month, every 6 months. So we have a rare date coming up this year, Leap Day. And then further information is on those addresses. The information is at the homepage /academic promotions. Questions addressed academic promotions at University of Galway. And there is a link there, and this presentation will be up online, but there's a link on the promotions website to the HR application system, which is how you apply. And it's on you to make sure that all the documentation is in order. Okay. So I am going to unshare if I can figure out how to unshare.